For fans of scandal and mystery, the Bogle-Chandler case of 1963 had it all. Two intellectuals who engaged in swindling were found murdered by the side of the road, poisoned with an unknown substance for an unknown reason. Here we are, 55 years later, and we still have no idea what happened that night. A physicist and former Rhodes Scholar who worked at the University of Sydney. He frequently had extramarital relationships, and at the moment of his death, he was engaged in one with Margaret Chandler, the wife of one of his colleagues. On New Year's Eve 1962, Bogle and the Chandlers went to the same party. In the subsequent investigation, Margaret's husband, Jeffrey, said that he and his wife had an understanding, so eventually he left to meet with his own lover, while Gilbert and Margaret departed early in the morning and headed for Lane Cove River, a popular lover's lane. That is where their bodies were found. They were half naked, but both were covered in items. Bogle with a carpet and Chandler with a cardboard box. Both threw up and excreted before dying. It was clear they had been poisoned, but because it was New Year's Day, tests were delayed and
but there does seem to be quite a lot of disappearances that have been reported on in the past, among other general weirdness. The first incident I could find rested there a while. Jimmy was ready to move on, but his friend had been drinking and they agreed to split up. been found or recovered. Now, I came across an article by Australia's ABC News which briefly spoke about some other historic disappearances on the Black Mountain. Here are a few that they briefly highlighted. In circa 1800, notorious criminal Sugarfoot Jack and his accomplices flee to Black Mountain following an exchange of projectiles. They were never seen again, despite an exhaustive search. July 1872, a courier named Philip Grainer goes out looking for his stray calf. He, his horse, and the calf never return. November 1882, two cattlemen, Harry Owens and George Hawkins, disappear while looking for stray cattle around Black Mountain, as does one of the police trackers searching for the missing men. A second tracker returns completely unhinged and unable to provide a coherent report. 1890, Constable Ryan tracks a fugitive to a cave at Black Mountain. He enters to see if the fugitive might be hiding inside. According to those present, he never came back out. I came across an article by the Sunday Mail wrote in January of 1934, which reported a couple of these incidents in more detail. Early one Sunday morning in November 1882, Harold Owens, a well-known and popular settler of the Oakey Creek district, several miles west of Cooktown, left his farm on horseback to search the Black Mountain country for some horses he had lost. A few hours later, he was seen heading for the mountain by a carrier who was travelling along the Palmer River Road, and that was the last that was ever seen or heard of Owens and his horse. In this case, the police and Aborigine trackers, assisted by hundreds of friends of the Owens family, made an exhaustive search of the mountain and a vast area of country in the vicinity, but again, no trace of the missing man was found. Owens and his horse had completely vanished. The search parties had just given up the search when yet another man was reported to have disappeared at the mountain. This was George Hawkins, a well-known person of the 4 Mile district outside Cooktown. This is important because the ABC article made it sound like Harold and George disappeared together, but there was about a month in between the two disappearances. Quite literally, the search for Harold had just ended when George also disappeared and the searchers were once again out and looking. Continuing on, George had a club foot, and one fine morning in December 1882 he left the 4 Mile district and rode towards the Black Mountain in order to ascertain whether there was any feed for cattle in the locality. He had been talking about taking up some land in the vicinity. Hawkins, of course, knew all about the mysterious disappearances, but he took little notice of them and declared that the men must have got lost somewhere, which was hardly feasible since both of the missing men were experienced bushmen. At any rate, Hawkins proceeded along the Palmer River Road where he met several travellers. He spoke to one of these near the mountain and mentioned that he was visiting the country around the strange hill. As the traveller continued on his way, he looked back and saw Hawkins leave the road and ride in the direction of the mountain. And that was the last that was ever seen or heard of Hawkins or his horse. These two disappearances, and the fact that absolutely nothing was turning up at all, created a local sensation, in that everyone in the area was absolutely determined to figure out what had happened. After George went missing, even more people turned up to search. Harold nor George has ever been found, nor any bones or anything like that. The Aboriginal trackers had said in both instances that there was no evidence of foul play or animal predation, which brings us to an interesting quote. The official verdict in both cases was disappeared at Black Mountain, but the natives' verdict was that they were eaten up altogether by Devil. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, I've never actually heard of that term before, but according to Oxford Language at 4 o'clock, they must not go chasing the Bardees, they wouldn't be allowed. They reckon these Devil will take them away. That is a little bullshit, man. As soon as the sun goes down, he starts edging them off and taking them away. I have no idea what Bardees are. Noongar, though, refers to a person of southwest about that, then I'd welcome you to correct me in the comments. It's so weird that all over the world, these cultures used to talk about little people that would make people disappear. I didn't even mean to find that, by the way. I had no idea that the natives talked about this, or I'd have included it in the Hidden People video. In any case, just out of curiosity, and briefly, this is how the natives describe the Buliets. He's a little hairy man, about 2 feet high. He's a devil. He will take the children. They must not go out after dark, after 4 PM. Right, in any case, let's stop getting sidetracked and have a more in-depth look at what happened to Philip Grainer. At this time, one of the best known carriers engaged on the Cooktown-Palmer River route was a man named Philip Grainer. One evening, during July of 1872, he was on his way to the Palmer River with a pack horse team loaded with provisions. He camped with some other carriers near the Black Mountain. That night, however, 3 of his horses broke loose and galloped away in the direction of the mountain. At daybreak the next morning, Grainer mounted another horse and set out to search for the missing animals. He made straight for the mountain and was never seen again. When Grainer had not returned to the camp after 3 hours, the other carriers who were preparing to resume their respective journeys became alarmed. 3 of them rode towards the mountain shouting Philip's name. There was no response to their calls, however. They had barely reached the foot of the grim pile of granite slabs when they saw Grainer's saddled horse grazing contentedly nearby. The article then goes on to explain that there was no sign of Philip at all, and despite a thorough search, he was never found. The following day, a large police presence and Aboriginal trackers descended on the mountain to search for Philip, but they too couldn't find a trace of him. It's said that one of the Aboriginal trackers had said it's as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. It looks like it wasn't only the mountain that was scoured, but miles and miles around the area too. Again, the natives started talking about how this was the work of the Devil. I was hoping to find some information from the natives themselves, specifically just what they had to say about the mountain. ABC had spoken to one of the indigenous peoples there called Mary Shipton. This is what she had to say. As a small child, Mary was taught to respect the site and gets angry when tourists enter without permission or guidance. It's hard to tell them. They want to discover the country, but they don't know what's really there. A lot of people don't respect our culture. We see a lot of non-indigenous people. They think they know indigenous people by not walking on their country. For me, it's a sacred site and no one is allowed to go to that area. If they do, they will get very, very sick. I feel bad about it. They're heading straight into bad vibes there. So it's clear to see that the native peoples there ascribe disappearances and other negative events on the mountain to the more unusual side of things. ABC also spoke to another man there called Harold Ludwig, who I believe is indigenous too. He said, "In our Boros, spirits appear to us. It's not just a fairy tale, it's real. You see these things come to you." It's quite difficult to find specific information about this mountain. For example, what I was really interested in knowing was just how many people visit the national park annually. I thought this might be interesting because I can't for the life of me find any recent disappearances in the area, or anything like that, which is a good thing in all fairness. I can only seem to find these incidents that took place around and well over 100 years ago now. What I did come to realise though, is that Australia's Black Mountain isn't the only mountain with that name that is also associated with disappearances. This next in the United States. And with a title like that, who isn't interested in hearing more? Within less than half a century, many persons have been swallowed up in the deep ravines of the Black Mountain in Wise County, Virginia, never to be found again. The old mountain carries many strange secrets, says the New York Times. Many have ridden into its shadows only for the eternal gates of silence closing noiselessly behind them. The region is inhabited by mountain people who are a law unto themselves. Few men have ever ventured alone into the mountain and come back to tell the tale. What became of those who disappeared, nor how the manner in which those whose bodies have been recovered managed to pass away. The Seymour Daily Republican then makes the point that the general public at the time weren't really aware of the disappearances that were happening until a guy named Edward Leisenring Wentz disappeared in the area. Edward was a young millionaire from Philadelphia, and while it's not clear what he was doing that day, we know that he disappeared on the 14th of October 1904. That morning, he took his favourite horse and travelled to the Black Mountain area, and this would be the last time that he would ever be seen, as he never returned that evening, and this prompted a search. The search did actually find Edward's horse pretty quickly, and that was on the same evening. His horse was found abandoned with the bridle and the saddle still on near the Powell's River, not far from the Roaring Fork, which apparently is the spot where several other missing men disappeared from. For weeks, hundreds of men scoured the mountains, hunting through every ravine and in every cave for some trace of the lost man. The impression gained credence that Wentz had been taken supposedly for the purpose of ransom. This led to the offering of a reward of $55,000 for his return. Stimulated by the offer of the reward, hundreds of bold men joined in the search. This supposed ransom demand never actually materialised, and people quickly began to realise that something else must have happened here. And the search continued for quite some time because of the promise of a reward. Exactly 5 months after the official search for Edward reached its inconclusive conclusion, his body was actually found by a mountaineer who happened by it. He said that it was an odd sight and that Wentz was lying peacefully in a lonely spot among fallen trees. Edward's body, unfortunately, was in a state of decay, and it was impossible to determine a cause of passing, but no obvious injuries or anything like that was ever reported. We might have had more luck with today's tech, but back then, from what I understand, it was much more difficult to determine a diagnosis when in this context of decay. Locals wanted answers as to what had happened here, but unfortunately all they were left with was speculation. Some believed that this was intentional and that Edward purposely went up there to be at peace. Others made the argument that he wouldn't have just abandoned his favourite horse, which he seemed to be very fond of, and left it with its saddle still on. In the end though, it's not actually clear what happened to Edward, or how the initial massive search managed to miss him. The Seymour Daily Republican ended with this. The daily papers carried columns of well-written theories attempting to explain in some plausible manner the means and the cause of the passing of Wentz. But the secret lay hidden in the recesses of the Rocky Hills, and there were none so bold to go and look for it. It was then realised that over half a dozen men had disappeared in the same area as Edward over the course of the years, but only Edward's body had been discovered. The Seymour Daily Republican explains, all of the supposed victims of the mountains had ventured into the wild region where the mad waters of Roaring Creek leap and pitch down the rugged mountain ravine over shagged rocks to pour into the more quiet stream known as Powell's River. After the discovery of Edward's body, people began talking about a man who disappeared under unusual circumstances before him, James B. Gearhart. James was a Bristol insurance man who ventured out to the mountains, only to never return. The article explains, the disappearance of Gearhart is as much a mystery now as when the searchers were peering fearfully into the ravines searching for him. He left at his lodging quarters in Bristol a valuable library, a wardrobe full of valuable clothing and other personal property. These effects have remained unclaimed to this day. James was apparently staying at a hotel in Appalachia on business. It seems he was inspecting the mining areas of the region. One morning he set off to the Black Mountain and took the route which led the way of Roaring Fork and near Powell's River, which happened to be the place where the others are thought to have disappeared. That was the last ever seen of Gearhart. Inquiry has been made in every part of the country, but no trace has ever been found of the missing man. Now you can probably guess what I'm about to say, but all of the searches for James ended in failure, and no conclusions have ever been drawn as to what happened to him or the other men in the area. Years after these prior incidents, the former congressman James B. Richmond of Gates City relayed an interesting event that happened to him at the Black Mountain that held a parallel to Wentz and Gearhart. The occurrence in question took place just prior to the Civil War. Two men were searching for a herd of lost cattle in the wilds of the mountain region. When they came to the fatal spot near the mouth of Roaring Fork, they dismounted and hitched their horses in order to reach points that were inaccessible while mounted. They separated at the gorge, taking separate ridges in the ascent, having agreed to return and meet at the mouth of the gorge within a specified time. Only one of these men ever followed the backwards trail. He waited in vain and called repeatedly for his companion. Finally, as the shades of night began to fall, he mounted and rode away from the lonely spot alone. Search was made for the missing man immediately thereafter. From that day to this, and in the meantime, many other men have walked out of the world of men through the same rocky gorge. No trace of him has ever been discovered. Another incident was relayed too, in which the authorities had gotten wind of moonshiners somewhere in the area, and a group of revenue officers went to seek them out. They eventually decided to search the Black Mountain specifically, but all of them vanished there and not a single one returned. The authorities weren't sure what had happened and started an investigation into the incident. Some locals believed that the moonshiners got them, and others believed that there were sinister forces at work, and then they cited the previous incidents and history of the mountain. The federal government themselves took an interest in this and poured some resources into the search, and they expanded the available manpower. However, and as quoted from the article, the mountain remained silent. The searchers never found anything to give any kind of clue as to what might have happened to the officers. There were some that reasoned that they didn't believe that the moonshiners would have done this, even if they were operating in the area, because doing this has now attracted massive attention and, put a target on the back. What is interesting is that the dogs never found a scent either, which I suppose could indicate that the officers might have been moved off the mountain or to another area entirely, just buried somewhere far away from the actual search radius. Unfortunately, a time frame wasn't given here, but afterwards a young mining engineer called Walter Kemp and Thomas Kilgore, who was the superintendent of the miners, disappeared on the Black Mountain. The locals used to say that they were immune to the mountain's evils because they would traverse it quite a lot. Well, that apparently wasn't the case, because when they made this journey together up the Roaring Fork one day, they both disappeared and they never made it to their destination. The story becomes quite familiar now, in that again search parties were dispatched to the area once more, but like all the other incidents, they never found a hint of anything. No bodies were ever recovered, no clothes, no equipment, just no trace at all was found. And I'm sure you can imagine the rumours and superstitions that this was then brewing in the local communities. Right, just thematically at this point, I came across another Black Mountain, though this time much closer to me in the UK. Now, I'm from the north of England, but there is one in Wales, and I came across an interesting article that highlights an incident in which a person went missing, but thankfully was found. I thought that this would be an interesting one to go through because it can act as a reminder of just how careful and prepared you've got to be, because Mother Nature sometimes just has it in store for people. This incident happened in March of this year and was reported by the South Wales Guardian on the 5th of March. The woman who this happened to wanted to remain anonymous, but we know that she was around 50 years old. She's considered an experienced hiker who's very familiar with the Black Mountain and the surrounding areas too. She likes to take a dog for walks there, and this time was no different, except it was, and basically back to the car, but the wind physically knocked me over. This happened a few times and totally disoriented me. Then the rain started and it was hitting my face like heavy projectiles. I was trying to get back to the car, but I just couldn't find it. After a while, we hit a boggy area which I knew from previous walks was nowhere near the car. That's when I realised we weren't going to get back. At this point, in the area, then it's not going to be any help. Though I suppose it will register the location up until the point that there was no signal, so it could still help rescuers land closer to you. Three words no longer corresponded to her actual location, sending rescuers in the wrong